Hello and welcome to another Bobby Fischer video. So how good was Bobby Fischer in his prime when he was playing at his best? So feel free to leave a comment. I'm curious, what viewers and subscribers think. Some people put Bobby Fischer's name up there as the greatest player of all time. It's usually a toss-up between Fischer, maybe Kasparov, Karpov. Some people throw Tall in there, and of course Magnus Carlsen. But remember, Bobby Fischer didn't have the great computer chess programs back then that we have today. So many of today's players, they really get a lot of help from today's computers. So Bobby Fischer, an amazing player. So let's take a look at this game. Bobby Fischer starts out with e4. He was known for playing that, controlling the center here, attacking. It helps you get your queen and bishop out quickly. So he's playing against Tigran Petrosian, a former world champion. And whoever would win this match, this is the 1971 candidates final match between Fischer and Petrosian, and whoever would win would go on to play Spassky. And we know that Fischer won that entire match against Petrosian and went on to beat Boris Spassky and become the world chess champion in 1972 until 75 when he forfeited his title. He chose not to play against Karpov, and Karpov became the default world champion. So Petrosian, known as a super defensive player that played prophylactically, he would try and stop counterplay, maybe sometimes even before the opponent knew that they were going to have counterplay. He would just try and stop you in his tracks. Or stop you in your tracks before you even got an attack underway. So let's see what Fischer does here. We have the French defense. Fischer just takes control of the center. If your opponent is going to let you place both pawns in the middle, why not? But you have to be careful if you do that. You don't want to let your opponent take control of the center and overrun your position. So an immediate strike back in the center, targeting the e-pawn. And what does Fischer do? The computer recommends e5, pressing forward. Either that or defending with the knight. And Fischer plays knight to c3, guarding that pawn that's under attack. And the game continues with an interesting choice here by Petrosian. Most often, this knight is brought out after the c-pawn presses forward and attacks the d-pawn in the center. So something a little different here by Petrosian. Nowadays, usually the c-pawn will come out and the knight can move in behind that c-pawn and help put more pressure on this d-pawn. All right, knight just develops here. Fischer is bringing his pieces out quickly, as is his opponent. Now we have this pawn under attack here, along with knight and pawn attacking together. So what will Fischer do? He could press forward, attacking the knight. Let's see. He decides instead to just exchange in the center. So after recapture, we have an exchange variation. Sort of. We have these knights out here, so that's a little bit different. Game continues with Fischer developing his bishop, pinning the knight to the king. And now we have the first inaccuracy of the game by Petrosian. He decides to counterpin here against Fischer. So now let's see what Fischer does. But before we do, it looks like instead the computer recommends this pin over here, which would allow black the chance to quickly castle. So now Fischer immediately attacks, and then we have capture and another inaccuracy. Apparently it would have been better to drop back to d7, breaking this pin of the knight to the king. So what does Fischer decide to do here? He recaptures with the queen, of course, because this knight cannot go after the pawn, it's pinned. And Fischer didn't want to break up his pawns on the king side here, where he's probably going to castle. So the game continues with bishop developing, the best move in the position. Fischer attacks the knight here, and develops, and now he has the option to castle queenside. So let's see what happens here. An attack on the bishop right away. So capture, breaking the pawns up here on the queen side. So now Petrosian is left with some weaknesses over here. He has this weak isolated A pawn, the doubled C pawns. So the game continues with Fischer castling kingside, as does his opponent. And now Fischer places the rook on the open file. Usually a good choice here. Computer says it's good, but then it also recommends bringing the other rook over. But that would leave the rook on the F file kind of blocked in by its own rook. So the computer says this is still a good choice, bringing the rook from F1 out to E1. So now we have an attack on the bishop. Fischer retreats back, enticing his opponent to press further forward and create some weaknesses around the king. What does Petrosian do here? He declines that, bringing his queen forward. Now his rooks are connected. He also protects this pawn here. And so the game continues with Fischer bringing his rook up to E2, preparing to double rooks with a possible threat against this bishop. So Petrosian ignores that for the moment and decides to just gain space here on the queen side. So now we have the rooks doubling up, threatening the bishop. Bishop drops back, and another inaccuracy, the third inaccuracy by Petrosian. And with that inaccuracy, the game jumps to plus 1.2, so over the equivalent of over a pawn's worth of advantage, even though material is even. And let's see if Fischer can take advantage of that inaccuracy. The computer recommends B3 here to slow this pawn down. And sure enough, Fischer finds that move. And now, of course, the pawn can't push forward, or the knight could just capture. And then the knight would have the threat of jumping up here, attacking the queen, and then that pawn could push up there later. So rook moving to the half-open file, usually a good strategy. The computer does recommend queen to d6 instead, adding another defender to this. If the queen was here, it would add another defender to that knight. So now we have knight jumping forward, and now it's Fischer's turn for an inaccuracy here. The computer instead prefers the immediate bishop to g3, taking this diagonal, kind of lining up on the rook as well. So this move is probably not so bad. As I said, the knight could jump here and target the queen, and that would give Fischer time to press his A pawn up, possibly. So the game continues with knight grabbing the outpost here. What does Fischer do? And this is a discovered attack on his bishop as well. So that may be why the computer wanted Fischer to drop his bishop down here earlier. Because now, if that bishop retreats, the knight could just capture. So Fischer exchanges the bishops, the best move in the position, and white is still ahead at this point. Recapture, and the queen moves up the board a little bit. And what is Fischer thinking with this move? Well, perhaps he is thinking that he can push this pawn now and chase the knight out of that outpost. So the game continues with queen attacking queen. According to the computer, a great move here by Petrosian. If the queens are exchanged, well, it could, he could recapture towards the center with the pawn, and then that may allow him to push this pawn up in the future. So queens are exchanged, and now we have Fischer attacking immediately here, threatening to capture, and after recapture, Petrosian would be left with doubled isolated pawns. Not so good. So now Petrosian, instead of capturing in the center and getting rid of his doubled pawns that way, he drops back with the knight, where if the pawn captures, then the knight could recapture and blockade the isolated pawn. So the game continues with Fischer repositioning his rook, threatening to capture and then grab a pawn here. Computer says that's a good move, but c5 may have been the better choice, because if this pawn is pushed forward and we have a recapture, the knight will come back into the center here and have an outpost on c5. So the game continues with rook back to the half-open file. We have an exchange, and after recapture, sure enough, Petrosian is left with two doubled isolated pawns. Fischer has the one isolated pawn, but now Fischer is covering both of the open files with his rooks. So the game continues with f3, limiting the scope of the knight by covering these squares with the pawn. And what will Petrosian do at this point? The computer says the best move is to develop this rook that is sitting back here not doing much. So instead, knight to h5 is played, and computer likes that move. Normally you don't want to put a knight on the edge of the board, but from here, I guess the knight could jump here. The knight could go here and target the rook, and then maybe have a threat of jumping in here, trying to cause a little bit of chaos in the position. And also, by the knight moving, there's a possibility of pushing this pawn forward, gaining space on the king side. So Fischer attacks the weak pawns here, jumping his rook up to c6, targeting this pawn. And now knight moves forward, attacking the rook. So Fischer just slides his rook over, and now he's guarding this isolated pawn. He's preventing the knight from jumping into his position, and his king could move up here and get into the action, which is very important. You definitely want to try and get your king into the game, especially when there's queens off the board and there are not many pieces left. Okay, now we have the first mistake of the game here. We've had some inaccuracies, but an outright mistake by Petrosian. According to the computer, this doesn't look like a terrible move. You're just placing your rook on the open file. So what could be wrong with that? It doesn't seem too bad. The computer prefers rook at f to d8 instead, guarding this pawn. So that's probably why the computer said that's a mistake, because now Fischer could just pick off this pawn here on d6. So Yes, Fischer goes ahead and snaps up that pawn, going ahead in material. And now we have a check. It has allowed Petrosian to get into Bobby Fischer's position. He jumps up attacking the rook. But, what is this rook going to do? Fischer's rook is protecting the A pawn. It's guarding this G pawn, and the king is as well. If the king moves forward attacking the knight, the rook is still guarding. So here we have another mistake. I guess Petrosian was just not sure what to do here. He gets behind the pawn. Perhaps he's thinking about trying to push pawns open, push pawns forward and open up the king side. But, not a great position for this rook. Just stuck here in the corner. What does the computer recommend? Rook at B to E8. So the recommendation instead was just to double the rooks up on the open file here. Because if we go back and look at that, if you would double up here, there's a threat of pushing a rook up here. If you have a capture, the other rook could capture with check, and then pick off this pawn over here, and then maybe go after the next one, something like that. Now, of course, Fischer could counterattack by going after this pawn, maybe after chasing the knight away. So anyway, in the game, rook into the horrible square in the corner, and now Fischer moves up here, going after the knight. So knight retreats with a counterattacking check. The king just keeps running forward, and now G6 not only protects the knight, it gives the king, some room to move forward, and then maybe the knight can move back here, protect the pawn. But in the meantime, Fischer just snaps that pawn up. He's also attacking the other pawn, and it's not looking good for Petrosian. Fischer's ahead by +2 at this point. So Petrosian, trying to drum up some kind of counterplay, puts his rook on the open file. We have capture of another pawn by Fischer. So Fischer is just ahead by 3 pawns at this point. And it's just slowly going from bad to worse for Petrosian. So the game continues with rooks creating a doubling up battery here on the Fischer's first rank. But what will this be able to achieve? This rook is protecting pretty good here. So now we have Fischer dropping his knight back. Maybe preventing this move here. Targeting. If the rooks exchange and the other rook ends up here, it would be behind this passed pawn. So Fischer kind of prevents that. He covers that square. He helps protect the pawn, relieving the rook of guard duty, but the knight could come under attack. So here we have Petrosian trying to get his knight into the game here. So the game continues with king attacking the unprotected knight. The knight drops back, but it kind of blocks his open e-file for his own rook. This pawn is being targeted, but the rook is guarding at the moment. So will we have an exchange of rooks here? Now, if you're ahead in material, you want to exchange off pieces. Now, Petrosian, being behind in material, wants to exchange off as many pawns as he can, to try and save the game. Otherwise, Fischer is going to use all these pawns and try and promote one to a queen. So here we have an attack on Fischer's king. The king steps back. Another attack. And so king runs to the edge of the board, and Fischer has to watch out that he doesn't get in trouble here. So what does Fischer do next? Well, he jumps his knight up onto this outpost. There's a check threat here. Game continues with check. So Petrosian, he's trying to get something going here before he just loses this game. Some kind of counterplay. Fischer's king is running out of options here. He has to watch out. If he goes to h5, what are the possibilities here? Can that knight deliver a check? But then he would be able to run back to here. So let's see what Fischer does. He just steps his king over to the side. Now there is a mate threat here possible. Pushing forward, no, because this pawn would not be protected. So it looks like Fischer has everything well in hand here. So the game continues with Fischer ahead in material. And a good strategy when you're ahead is to just give back a little bit of material, and you'll still be ahead and winning, but you trade off more material, and that's less that your opponent has to fight back with. So Fischer gives up his knight here, exchanges off material. He gave up that knight for 2 pawns and maybe a third if he goes after that one. But the knight protects. Fischer, puts a little pressure on that knight. Interesting move here. All right, if the rook captures, well then this knight could drop down here, forking, regaining the rook. So what does Fischer do here? He does capture. And after the recapture, we're left with 5 points, 5 pawns versus a knight and a pawn. But the king is out of play over here. Fischer is attacking this other pawn. And it doesn't look like there's much that Petrosian can do. If Petrosian maybe goes over here to go after this pawn, the pawn could run, and then this pawn would be left unprotected. So the game continues with Fischer immediately trying to run his passed pawn up the board. And this is where Petrosian resigned. So here it looks like the best move is to bring this king up. But Fischer is just winning here. All he has to do is start running that pawn. Something like that. So let me delete that move. All right, before I look at how the game could have ended, let me put the game review up here. So how good was Bobby Fischer in his prime? Well, he played with 95.9% accuracy here, which is outstanding. Petrosian played with 90% accuracy. They both had one great move, no brilliant moves. But Fischer played 27 of the best moves versus 18 by Petrosian. And Fischer only had 1 inaccuracy in that game versus 3 by Petrosian and 2 mistakes. And then, this says the computer evaluation says that Fischer played at a 2950 level here versus 2550 by his opponent. 100% accuracy in the opening. Petrosian had 97.6. And then in the middle game, 94.8 for Fischer, 89.6 by Petrosian. And then 96.6% accuracy in the Endgame versus 68.8 by Petrosian. So Fischer was known to be a great Endgame player, and he played well in that Endgame. Let me know what you think. Feel free to leave comments. Do you think Fischer was the greatest player of all time? Do you think he was, one of the greatest? Definitely. But, was he as good as Kasparov and Magnus Carlsen? Now, keep in mind that even Kasparov and especially Carlsen today, they get a lot of help with the computers. They can evaluate things much better with the computer and check all the moves, especially with a high-powered computer with a chess program running like Stockfish. Anyway, interesting game. We see Fischer just grabbed the lead, and he pretty much just kept the lead and just grew it like crazy in the end till he was winning. And if we go back, how could the game have continued after A4? Apparently the computer recommends moving the king up. Maybe you come this way, but they don't like that move. What else is recommended? Knight to G3. Knight to C3. Yeah, no matter what, it looks grim because the knight will have to try and go over here and stop these pawns. The king could pick this pawn off and then start marching the other pawns. So great job there by Fischer. He would go on to win the World Chess Championship in 1972 against Boris Spassky. And it's a real shame that Fischer, kind of quit chess after he became world champion. Especially if Fischer would have played, in the modern age with computer assistance and computer evaluation, he probably would have been even more deadly over the chessboard. All right, well, like I said, feel free to leave any comments. Like and subscribe to support the channel if you haven't already. Thank you for watching and have a super chess day.